When the lawyer handed me the envelope that day, his expression was careful, measured, the way people look at you when they're delivering news that will change everything. "Mrs. Catherine," he said, "your husband's will has been executed. Everything is now legally yours. The keys to the farm, the deed, the land that sprawls across 1,200 acres of Virginia countryside, all of it was mine now." But as I held those cold metal keys in my palm, I felt something twist inside me, something that wasn't joy or relief. It was dread, pure, ice-cold dread, because for 37 years, Harold had forbidden me from going there. Not once. Not even when his mother was dying and he drove through the night alone. Not when his brother's house burned down and he had to coordinate the recovery from that place. Never. The mystery of it had haunted me for nearly 4 decades. What was he hiding? Why was that land, that house, that farm worth keeping from his own wife like some dark secret? Now, standing in the lawyer's office with the keys cutting into my fingers, I realized I was about to find out. But I planned to sell it. I'd always planned to sell it if I ever got the chance. Let someone else deal with whatever ghosts lived there. Let someone else unlock that door. I could take the money, finally travel to the places Harold had always said we couldn't afford. But something whispered inside me, a voice that sounded almost like curiosity. Just look first. Just see what it is. Just walk through that door once before you sign it all away. That whisper would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to tell you about the farm first, about the way it haunted our marriage from the very beginning. Harold inherited it from his father when he was just 23 years old, fresh out of university with big dreams and bigger secrets. I was 21 when I met him at a dance in Richmond, and he was magnetic in that way. Some men are handsome, charming, with this electric energy that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He asked me to dance, and I said yes, and then he kept asking, and I kept saying yes, until 6 months later he asked me to marry him. I remember he took my face in his hands and said, "Catherine, I need to tell you something before you say yes. There's something about my life that's complicated, something I'm not ready to explain. But if you marry me, you have to trust me. You have to promise that you won't ask about it and you won't go looking for it, because some things are better left alone." I was so young, so in love, so sure that whatever the secret was, we could overcome it together if he just gave it time. I promised. God help me, I promised. And he slipped a diamond ring on my finger, and we got married in the fall of that year in a small church, and we built a life that was beautiful in almost every way, except for that one impossible thing. The farm became the third party in our marriage, the thing that was always there, always mentioned but never discussed. He would get letters from the property manager, quarterly financial statements, and he'd read them quietly in his study with the door closed. When his family would ask why we never visited, he'd change the subject. When I'd gently suggest that maybe we should see the place, that it was important to understand where his money came from, his face would go hard and distant. "Catherine," he'd say quietly, "I meant what I said. Some things are better left alone. If you love me, you won't ask again." And I loved him too much to push. I loved him too much to risk losing him. So I didn't ask. For 37 years, I didn't ask. We built a life here in Richmond. I taught music theory at the university for 20 years before I retired. Harold became a successful architect, ironic, given that he owned a house he refused to enter. We had 2 children, Sarah and Michael, and we raised them to be kind and thoughtful and curious about the world. But there was always this thing between us, this unspoken agreement that we didn't talk about. When Sarah asked about grandfather's farm, Harold would say, "It's just old land," in a way that made clear the conversation was over. When Michael tried to visit once when he was 17, desperate to see where his family's money came from, Harold told him absolutely not without permission, and he never asked again. The farm became this mythological place in our house, this thing that was real. We got quarterly reports about its revenue, crop yields, maintenance costs, but completely forbidden, like Bluebeard's chamber, like the room you're never supposed to open. I spent 37 years wondering what was in that room. In my mind, I imagined everything. Maybe it was a family scandal. Maybe there was a woman there, a mistress, a secret family, something that would explain why he never wanted me to see it. Maybe he'd hidden money there, or there was a crime, or some kind of structural catastrophe he was ashamed of. My imagination ran wild with possibilities, and each one hurt in a different way because it meant that Harold didn't trust me, didn't love me enough to let me in on his truth. We were happy otherwise. We laughed together, we made love, we traveled and built a life that looked perfect from the outside. But there was always that wall, that boundary, that part of him that belonged only to the farm and whatever secrets it held. Then, 5 years ago, Harold had a heart attack. A massive one, unexpected, the kind that doesn't give you time to say goodbye or make peace or do any of the things you think you'll have time to do. One moment he was sitting at breakfast reading the paper, the next moment he was gone. The doctor said it was quick, that he didn't suffer, and I was grateful for that mercy even as my whole world collapsed. At the funeral, people came from everywhere, from the university, from the architecture firm he'd founded, from our church, from neighborhoods all over Richmond where he'd designed homes that people loved. They all stood at his grave and told stories about what a good man he was, how generous, how kind, how principled. And I stood there in my black dress and my black veil, and I thought, you didn't know him. You didn't know that he kept secrets from his wife for nearly 4 decades. You didn't know that there was a whole part of his life that he locked away and refused to share. You didn't know that for 37 years, I didn't know what he was hiding. The will reading was formal and strange. The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, sat across from me in his office, and he explained the documents methodically. The house in Richmond was mine. The retirement accounts were mine. The investments were mine. And then he got to the farm. The farm, he said carefully, is yours now, all 1,200 acres. The house that sits on it, the equipment, everything. He slid a folder across the desk toward me, and inside was the deed, the title, all the legal documentation that proved the property was now mine. I held that folder in my hands, and I felt this strange sense of vertigo, like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. This place that Harold had guarded so jealously, this thing that had come between us, was now mine to do with as I wished. I could sell it tomorrow. I could tear it down. I could walk through that house and finally see what he'd been hiding all these years. Or I could never look at it again, just sign the papers to the real estate agent and let it become someone else's mystery. "What's the property like?" I asked Mr. Patterson. "I've never actually seen it." He looked at me with surprise and then with something like pity. "Mrs. Catherine," he said, "your husband never took you to see it? I shook my head. He leaned back in his chair. "It's a beautiful property," he said finally, "well maintained. There's a house, probably built in the 1922nd, been updated several times. There are barns, agricultural outbuildings. It's been managed by a property manager for decades. It generates decent revenue, the land is leased to a farming cooperative, and there's some forestry income as well. It's a valuable asset." He paused. "Have you decided what you're going to do with it?" I hadn't. Or rather, I had decided I'd sell it, but standing there in his office, with the keys in my hand and the reality of ownership settling over me like a weight, I wasn't so sure anymore. I drove toward the farm on a Tuesday in October, 3 months after the will reading, when I finally felt ready to actually look at the place. It took me 4 hours to drive from Richmond into the countryside, deeper and deeper into farmland, through small towns that looked like they'd been stuck in time for decades, past fields of corn being harvested, and orchards heavy with the last of the season's fruit. I'd been to this part of Virginia maybe twice in my entire married life, both times passing through on the way somewhere else, and each time I'd felt Harold tense up next to me, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as we got closer to the county line where the farm was located. This time I drove alone, with the windows down and the autumn air rushing through, and I felt a peculiar mixture of terror and anticipation. What if I got there and it was just a house? What if there was nothing? No dramatic revelation, no secret that explained 37 years of silence. What if I'd spent all this time imagining monsters under the bed, only to find that the bed was empty? Or worse, what if the secret was something so ordinary, so mundane, that Harold's shame about it seemed ridiculous? I drove past the turnoff 3 times before I realized the sign was old, faded, the paint peeling away so that you could barely read the name. Ashland Farm. Harold had never mentioned the name. I turned down the long gravel drive, and my heart began to pound. The property was beautiful, I had to admit that immediately. Ancient oak trees lined the drive, their branches forming a canopy above my head. I could see fields spreading out on either side, the late afternoon light turning everything golden. In the distance, I could see the shapes of buildings, and beyond that, the outline of a house against the darkening sky. I drove slowly, taking it all in, trying to understand why Harold had wanted to keep this away from me. It wasn't dark or menacing or obviously wrong. It was peaceful. It was beautiful. It looked like home. I parked my car in front of the house, and for a long moment, I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, my keys in my lap, not moving. The house was brick, 2 stories, with white trim around the windows and a wide porch across the front. Behind it, I could see gardens overgrown now, untended, but still full of the bones of what had once been careful, loving landscaping. Roses grew wild along the foundation, their blooms heavy and fragrant even in autumn. There were magnolia trees, and what looked like an old herb garden gone to seed. Someone had loved this land once. Someone had planted these gardens with intention, with the hope that they would grow and flourish and last. I sat there thinking about all the reasons I should just turn around, drive back to Richmond, call a realtor, and be done with it. 1,200 acres. $23,000 in annual property taxes. Building permits and surveying fees if I decided to develop any of it. The whole thing was a burden, a weight, a complication I didn't need at my age. I was 62 years old. I had enough money, I didn't need 1,200 acres of Virginia countryside and all the responsibility that came with it. I could sell it, take the proceeds, donate half to some charity that meant something to me, and use the rest to finally do the things Harold had always said we couldn't afford. I could go to Italy. I could study painting in France. I could spend a month in Greece watching the sun set over the Aegean. I could do all of those things without ever looking inside this house. But curiosity is a terrible thing. It's more powerful than fear, more compelling than logic, and it doesn't care how old you are or how sensible your plans are. It just pulls at you, whispering, "Just look, just one look." It won't hurt to just open the door and see what's inside. The autumn light was beginning to fade, and if I was going to do this, I needed to do it soon. I got out of my car and walked toward the house, my footsteps loud on the gravel, echoing back to me like there was someone else walking beside me, matching my pace, breathing my air. The front porch creaked when I stepped on it, and I had a moment of almost superstitious fear, like the house was watching me, waiting to see what I would do, like it had been waiting for 37 years for Harold's widow to finally come and unlock its secrets. I pulled out the keys the lawyer had given me. There were 3 of them on an old brass ring alongside a small brass key I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking. I could feel my pulse in my temples, in my throat, in the tips of my fingers. This was ridiculous. It was just a house, just a building made of brick and wood and glass. It couldn't hurt me. But Harold had protected this place so fiercely, had guarded it so completely, that it felt dangerous. It felt like opening a door that was never meant to open. I tried the first key in the lock, and it turned smoothly, easily, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment, as if the house had been holding its breath all these years, waiting for me to come home. The lock clicked. The mechanism turned. The door swung inward into shadow, and the smell, oh God, the smell that hit me then, that poured out through the open doorway like a living thing. I caught my breath, and the smell filled my lungs, and I knew in that instant that Harold's secret, whatever it was, had nothing to do with scandal or shame or crime. The smell was lavender. Dried lavender and something else. Something like soap, or maybe sachets. The smell of care. The smell of love. The smell of someone who had tended this house with intention and devotion, who had placed lavender in drawers and closets, and maybe even in the spaces between walls, trying to preserve something, trying to keep something safe. I stood in the doorway with my hand on the frame, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to understand what this smell meant, or why Harold had kept it from me, or what it meant that it was here, waiting, like it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, and the door swung closed behind me with a soft click, like the house was closing its hand around me, holding me, finally letting me in after all these years. The foyer was dim, lit only by the fading daylight coming through the tall windows on either side of the door. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, shapes began to emerge. There was a staircase, elegant and curved, with a polished banister. There were portraits on the walls, oil paintings in ornate frames, all of them showing people I didn't recognize. A man in a 3-piece suit from the 1952nd, a woman in a pearl necklace and dark dress, a young boy holding a puppy. Harold? Was one of these paintings Harold as a child? I couldn't tell in the dimness. There was a crystal chandelier overhead, covered in dust, and beneath it a side table with a vase of flowers. Dead flowers. long dead. Whatever flowers had once stood in that vase were now skeletal, brown, brittle, their remains scattered across the table surface. I reached for the wall and found a light switch. I flipped it, and nothing happened. The power was off. Of course it was off. The house had been empty for years, ever since Harold's father had died. For years. It had been sitting here dark and empty, except for the visits from the property manager, except for the quarterly maintenance, except for the lavender that someone had placed here to keep the air fresh and the memories preserved. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the space in sharp, harsh relief. The living room was to my right, and when I shone the light in that direction, I felt my breath catch. It was like stepping backward in time. Everything was exactly as it must have been when Harold was young, when his father still lived here. There was a sofa upholstered in deep green velvet, magazines arranged on a side table next to it. A radio, an actual radio like people had owned in the 1960 seconds. A television in a wooden cabinet. The walls were lined with bookshelves, packed with hundreds of volumes, leather-bound and cloth-bound and paperback. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, there were photographs. I moved toward them, drawn by something I couldn't quite name, and I shone my light on them one by one. A man in military uniform. The same man, older, in a suit, with a young boy beside him. The boy again, a bit older, maybe 10 years old, holding something in his hands. A young Harold, I realized. This was young Harold, and he was smiling. He was looking at the camera with such pure joy, such unguarded happiness, that for a moment I couldn't reconcile this boy's face with the man I had married. The man who had kept his own life locked away from me like it was dangerous. I moved deeper into the house, room after room, each one revealing more of this preserved life. The kitchen was immaculate, old-fashioned, with a cast-iron stove and glass-fronted cabinets. Everything was clean, everything was organized. Someone had been maintaining this place not just to preserve property, but to preserve memory. The dining room had a table set for 6 fine china still on the shelves, crystal glasses waiting for someone to fill them with wine. There were framed photographs everywhere. On every wall, on every surface, pictures of Harold's father, his mother, Harold himself, and other faces I didn't recognize. Family, I assumed. The family that lived in this house, the family that Harold came from, the family that had shaped who he was. Upstairs, I found bedrooms with quilts on the beds, wardrobes filled with clothes that smelled of mothballs and thyme, bathrooms with towels folded on racks. And in the master bedroom, in Harold's parents' room, I found something that made me sit down on the edge of the bed and put my face in my hands. It was a photograph album, leather-bound and ancient, sitting on the nightstand like it had been placed there waiting for someone to find it. I picked it up with trembling fingers and opened it. Page after page of photographs. Harold as a baby, Harold's first day of school, Harold at university, and underneath each photograph, captions in a woman's careful handwriting. Harold's mother, I realized. She had documented everything. Every moment of her son's life, carefully preserved, carefully labelled, carefully cherished. And then, near the back of the album, I found a section that made my heart stop. It was photographs of Harold as a young man, older now, already an architect, already successful. And in these photographs, he was not alone. He was with another person, a man, They were standing together in the garden outside this house, their shoulders touching. They were sitting on the porch, holding hands. They were standing in front of the house with their arms around each other, both of them smiling at the camera with such tenderness, such love, that it was almost unbearable to look at. And under the last photograph, in handwriting I didn't recognize Harold's own handwriting, younger and less steady than I remembered, was a caption. Together at last, August 1979. I sat there on that bed in the darkness, my phone's flashlight illuminating the photograph, and I felt everything I had believed about my husband, about our marriage, about our life together, begin to crack and shift and reorganize itself into a new shape. August 1979. That was before we met. That was before I danced with him in Richmond and he took my face in his hands and asked me to marry him, asking me to trust him, asking me to promise not to ask questions about a part of his life he said was too complicated to explain. This man in the photograph, this person he had his arm around, this must have been what he meant. This was the secret. This was the thing that was better left alone. But it wasn't left alone, was it? Someone had kept this house exactly as it was. Someone had maintained it. Someone had placed lavender in the drawers to keep the memories fresh. Someone had loved Harold enough to create a shrine to who he had been, or who he had wanted to be, before he married me, before he became the man I had known for 37 years. I heard a sound then. A creak from downstairs, like a floorboard settling, or like someone walking. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, my mouth suddenly dry. But there was no one here. The property manager came quarterly, but it wasn't the quarterly visit. No one had reason to be in this house. I was alone. I had to be alone. And yet the house was so full of presence, so full of the weight of all these preserved years, all these kept secrets, all these carefully maintained memories, that it felt like I wasn't alone at all. It felt like Harold was here, everywhere, watching me, seeing me discover what he had hidden from me for nearly 4 decades. Seeing me finally understand what had cost him so much to keep secret. I looked around the room in the beam of my flashlight. The walls were papered in a faded pattern, roses and vines, elegant and old-fashioned. There were paintings, not portraits, but landscapes, scenes of water and sky, the kind of thing that someone might paint because it soothed them, because it reminded them of a place they wanted to be, a life they wanted to live. On the dresser, there was a jewelry box, carved wood, the kind that plays music when you open it. I reached out and lifted the lid, and the tinkling of a lullaby began to play, thin and high and heartbreaking in the darkness. Inside, on red velvet, lay more photographs, smaller ones, hidden ones. Harold, younger still, maybe in his 20s, his arm around the same man, both of them laughing, both of them impossibly beautiful in their youth and in their joy. I closed the box and the music stopped. I sat with the photograph album still open in my lap, my hands shaking, my entire body shaking, as the realization of what I had found, what Harold had hidden, what all of this meant, finally, fully, irrevocably sank into my consciousness. This wasn't a scandal. This wasn't a crime or a secret family or a financial disaster. This was something far more intimate, far more revealing. This was the truth of who Harold had been before he became the man he had to be, before he buried that part of himself so deep that I hadn't even known to look for it. This was love. The kind of love that had to be hidden, had to be guarded, had to be locked away in a house that he never visited, that he never let anyone see, that he let slowly gather dust and fade away until it became just another room in a house that no one was supposed to enter. And I, his wife, his partner, the woman he had built a life with, had never known. For 37 years, I had lived beside a mystery I couldn't solve, a wall I couldn't scale, a part of him that he refused to give me access to. And now, sitting here in this dark bedroom with a photograph album open in my lap and the smell of lavender surrounding me like a ghost, I finally understood. Harold hadn't been hiding from me. He had been hiding for himself. He had been protecting something so precious, so terrifying, so unspeakable in the world he lived in, that he could only preserve it in this locked house, in this time capsule, in this shrine to a person he no longer let anyone see. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes or hours, I couldn't say. Time felt strange, elastic, like it was bending around this moment, stretching it out, making it last longer than any moment had a right to last. The photograph album was still open in my lap, and my fingers kept returning to that image. Harold and this man, both so young, so alive, so completely, radiantly in love. August 1979. 20 years before I met him. 20 years before he took my face in his hands and asked me to promise not to ask questions. I looked at Harold's face in that photograph, at the expression in his eyes. He was looking at the other man like he was looking at his entire future, like he couldn't believe his luck, like this moment was everything he'd ever wanted and feared he'd never have. Had he been thinking about this man that entire time? Was that what the silence had been about? Not shame, but longing? Not fear, but grief? Not anger, but loss? I looked around the bedroom, at the carefully preserved space, at the lavender that still perfumed the air after all these years, and I realized something that made my chest tight with a new kind of pain. Someone had maintained this room. Someone had kept it exactly as it was, as if waiting for him to come home. But he never did. For decades, Harold never came home to this place, to this love, to this truth about himself, and I had made it easier for him not to, by never asking, by never pushing, by creating a space where his denial could flourish. I had become complicit in his erasure of himself. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting, and made my way to the dresser. There was a mirror above it, ornate and dusty, and in the beam of my phone's flashlight, I caught my reflection. I looked older than I had ever looked before, like I had aged 10 years in the last hour. My face was pale, my eyes red, my mouth open slightly, as if I was in the middle of saying something I couldn't quite find the words for. The woman, staring back at me, was a stranger. This wasn't the woman Harold had married. This wasn't the woman who had spent 37 years building a life with a man she thought she knew. This was someone else entirely. Someone who had just discovered that the life she'd lived was based on a fundamental lie. I turned away from the mirror, unable to bear looking at myself, unable to bear the weight of 37 years of not knowing, not asking, not seeing. The dresser had drawers, and I pulled one open without thinking, without deciding to do it. Inside lay photographs, hundreds of them, all of them images of Harold with the same man, in a car, looking radiant and free. At a restaurant, leaning close, holding hands under the table, on a beach somewhere tropical, their bodies bronzed and beautiful in the sunlight. At what looked like a university campus, sitting on the grass with their arms around each other, they spanned years, dating back by the looks of the photos to at least the early 70s. A whole history I had never known about, a whole love story that had happened in my complete absence and complete ignorance. I saw Harold's transformation over the years in these photographs, from the ecstatic young man to something more settled and familiar, though never quite settled into the life he'd actually chosen. I sat back down on the bed and I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I cried, really cried, not the polite, composed tears of a widow at a funeral, but the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep inside you that you didn't even know it existed until suddenly you couldn't hold it back anymore. The kind of crying that shakes your whole body and makes you forget how to breathe. When the tears finally stopped, my face was raw and my hands were shaking. I went downstairs with the photograph album still clutched to my chest, and I began to search, not randomly, but with purpose now. I wanted to find more. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know everything about this man who had married me, who I had loved, who had kept this entire other self locked away like some kind of disease. In the study, I found a desk covered in papers, bills, correspondence from the property manager, tax documents, and letters. So many letters. I picked up the letters with trembling fingers. They were old, from the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. And they were from someone named David. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely read the handwriting. But I read them. I read every word. David was the man in the photographs. He had written to Harold over the years, long letters, some of them 20 pages or more, about their life, about his work, about his family, about his sadness that Harold had chosen a different life, married a different person, closed that door and locked it behind him. The letters were heartbreaking. They were filled with love and ache and a kind of resigned understanding that was somehow worse than anger would have been. In the early letters, David still seemed hopeful. He still believed that Harold would come back, that they could find a way to be together, that this separation was temporary. But as the years went on, the hope faded. By the 1,990 seconds, David's letters were gentler, more accepting. He wrote about his own life, his own partners, his own joy, but always with a thread of loss running through it. And then in some of the last letters, from the early 2000s, David wrote about growing ill. He mentioned doctors and tests and a diagnosis. He wrote about his fear, his pain, but also about his faith that Harold still cared, even if he couldn't show it. And then the letters stopped. There were no more letters after 2003, just silence. Just the absence of David's voice, which had been a constant presence in this house for decades. I sat at that desk in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of a man's secret life, and I tried to understand what Harold must have felt. The guilt, certainly. The shame, probably, given the time period, given the world he lived in. But also the grief, the terrible, consuming, inescapable grief of losing the person you love most and not being able to grieve them openly. Harold had loved this man. That much was clear from every photograph, every letter, every carefully preserved item in this house. And at some point, Harold had made a choice. A choice I couldn't fully understand or judge because I had never faced the world that had forced him to make it. He had turned away. He had married me. He had built a life that was respectable and acceptable and completely, fundamentally untrue to who he actually was. And he had let someone he loved die without ever going back to him, without ever reconciling, without ever saying goodbye in person. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. I felt it pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I opened one of the last letters, dated from 2003, just months before the letters stopped. In it, David wrote, "Harold, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you've been reading any of these, but I want you to know that I'm not angry with you. I was for a long time, but I'm not anymore. I understand that you chose a life that I couldn't be part of. I understand that you made a choice for peace or safety or whatever it was you needed. I just want you to know that what we had was real. What we had mattered. Even if the world says it doesn't, even if you've decided it doesn't, it did. It does. I love you. I will always love you. Even after I'm gone, I'll love you. That's what I want you to remember." I closed the letter and sat in the darkness, and I realized that I had been complicit in this. By not asking, by not pushing, by accepting Harold's boundaries so completely, by never demanding that he explain himself, I had made it easier for him to hide. I had enabled this silence. I had been the accomplice to his erasure. That knowledge was perhaps the most painful of all. I continued to explore the house as the night deepened. In the basement, I found boxes filled with letters, journals, notebooks, pages and pages of David's handwriting, documenting their life together, their travels, their dreams. I found paintings that Harold must have done as a young man, watercolors of landscapes and portraits, all of them unsigned. I found his signature in the back corner of one painting, but it had been scratched out, obliterated. I found keepsakes, theatre tickets from productions they'd attended together, receipts from restaurants where they dined, small treasures that people collect when they're building a life with someone they love. I found napkins with inside jokes written on them. I found a pressed flower, dried and brittle, in an envelope marked with a date from 1978. I found so many pieces of a life that Harold had lived and then deliberately hidden away. I found a wedding announcement from a society newspaper dated August 1980. Harold and a woman named Patricia, not me, some other woman. A woman whose name appeared nowhere else in this house, which meant the marriage hadn't lasted. Harold's first marriage, the one he must have entered into to escape this, to try to be the person the world wanted him to be. A desperate attempt to prove something to himself, to prove something to everyone else. That marriage must have failed. And then, years later, he met me, and I, poor, foolish, trusting me, had promised not to ask questions. I had promised to accept his boundaries, to respect his privacy, to love him without knowing him. What a gift I had given him. What an escape route I had provided. And he had been grateful for that, I think. Grateful that I didn't push, didn't demand, didn't force him to reconcile the two halves of himself. Grateful that I allowed him to live in a kind of peace, even if it was a peace built on lies and silence. I had made it possible for him to live in this comfortable lie, and he had repaid that by being, in his way, kind to me. We had been happy. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was real. And maybe I was beginning to understand that had to be enough. But it shouldn't have had to be. It shouldn't have been necessary. The world shouldn't have demanded this of him. Morning came, and I found myself still awake, still in the study, surrounded by the evidence of Harold's other life. I hadn't slept. I had sat in that desk chair reading letters, studying photographs, trying to piece together a timeline of a love that had existed parallel to my marriage for so many years. The sun rose outside the windows, and the light began to fill the room, chasing away the shadows, making everything clearer and somehow more painful. The golden light of morning seemed to illuminate not just the room, but the impossible choice before me. I looked at the photograph albums, the letters, the keepsakes, and I tried to decide what to do. I could burn it all. I could destroy every trace of David, every piece of evidence that Harold had ever lived this other life. I could close up the house, sell it to someone who didn't know its history, and keep this secret locked inside myself the way Harold had kept it locked all these years. I could pretend I'd never come. I could live with this knowledge and never speak of it. That would have been the easy choice, in a way. It would have preserved Harold's privacy, protected his reputation, ensured that his secret died with me, but it would also mean that David would disappear completely. It would mean that their love would be erased, as if it had never existed, as if it had never mattered to anyone, as if it was a shame to be hidden rather than a truth to be honored. Or I could do something else. I could acknowledge this. I could honor it. I could look at this life that Harold had lived and lost, and I could do something to make sure it wasn't completely forgotten, completely erased, completely gone as if it had never mattered. Harold was gone. David was gone. But what they had was real, and it deserved to be remembered. It deserved to matter. It deserved to exist in the world, acknowledged and seen, instead of hidden away like a shame, like something broken, like something wrong. I spent the entire day in that house, going through every room, every drawer, every closet. It was like excavating a life that had been buried alive. I compiled everything I could find about David. His full name was David Michael Chen. He had been an artist, a photographer, an architect like Harold. He had been born in 1950, which made him a year younger than Harold. I found his portfolio in a drawer of the study. Photographs of extraordinary beauty. Landscapes that captured light in ways that seemed impossible. Portraits that revealed the soul of the subject. He had been gifted. He had been brilliant. And he had loved Harold with a devotion that shone through every frame, every image, every careful composition. He had died in 2004 of complications from AIDS. I found his death certificate in a folder marked Estate Matters. Harold had attended to his affairs, it seemed. Harold had been there at the end, or at least he had taken care of things afterward. There were medical bills, funeral receipts, correspondence with hospitals, notes in Harold's handwriting indicating he'd paid for things out of his own pocket, had taken care of David's final expenses, had made sure he was dignified in death, even if he couldn't be honored in life. Harold had done his duty, even from a distance. Even while living his other life, even while I had no idea any of this was happening, I thought of all the times Harold had taken business trips during our marriage, all the times he'd gone away for a few days and come back quiet and subdued, withdrawn into some private chamber of grief I couldn't access. I thought of the times he'd received phone calls and excused himself from the room, his voice taking on tones I didn't recognize. I thought of the times he'd stared out the window at nothing, lost somewhere I couldn't reach, somewhere that was clearly more real to him than whatever was in front of him. How many of those times had he been thinking about David? How many of those times had he been grieving the man he loved, the life he couldn't live, the choice he'd made decades earlier that had seemed necessary at the time but had only created more distance, more pain, more silence? By evening, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to sell the farm. I wasn't going to erase this place or pretend it had never meant anything. I was going to preserve it, but not in the way Harold had preserved it, as a mausoleum to a dead love. I was going to make it live again. I was going to make sure that David was acknowledged, that his life was seen, that his love for Harold was recognized as something real and true and worthy of remembrance. I was going to transform this tomb into a sanctuary. I called a local attorney from my car while sitting in the driveway of the house, and I asked about establishing a foundation in the name of the property. I asked about turning it into an artist's retreat, a place where photographers and painters and designers could come and create and live and be free to be exactly who they were, a place where artists like David could flourish without fear, without hiding, without having to choose between their art and their truth. I asked about setting up residencies, about creating scholarships, about opening this place to the world instead of locking it away. I didn't mention David or Harold by name, but the woman on the phone understood what I was asking. She understood that I was trying to create a legacy, a space, a place where someone's love could be honored even after death, where someone's life could be celebrated instead of erased. The attorney was kind and professional and asked no uncomfortable questions. She simply asked me what I wanted to accomplish. And when I told her, she said, "That's a beautiful vision. Let's make it real." Over the next several months, I worked with lawyers and architects and historians to transform the farm into something new. We had to be careful, respectful, sensitive to the history of the place while making it alive again. I kept the main house but restored it carefully, reverently. I installed modern amenities for the artists who would come to stay, but kept the bones of the place exactly as they were. The gardens were restored. The lavender was planted anew, not to preserve the past, but to create continuity, to say that this love, this life, this truth was worth continuing to honor. I converted the barns into studios, professional spaces, with good light and equipment for photographers, painters, sculptors, and designers. I set up residencies for artists, subsidized for emerging talents and artists from marginalized communities. I created a library in the study where I carefully, lovingly archived the papers I had found, anonymized but preserved, a researcher's archive, a historical record, proof that this love existed, that it mattered, that it deserved to be studied and understood. And in one room upstairs, I created a small memorial, not to David specifically, though he was there too, a memorial to all the people who had had to hide themselves, who had had to live in the shadows, who had loved people they couldn't openly love, who had lived and died without the world ever knowing their names or their stories or the depth of their hearts. I put photographs on the walls, not just of Harold and David, but images I found from the estate, historical photographs, artwork by David, artwork by Harold. I displayed their creative work side by side, showing how their lives had intertwined, how their love had expressed itself through art. I included Harold's watercolours, displayed them as the serious art. They were no longer hidden or unsigned. And underneath the largest painting, I placed a small plaque with a quote from David's final letters. "To love freely is to live freely," it read, "and I will never stop loving him, no matter what the world says, no matter what he becomes, no matter what he chooses. That love is real, and it will outlast every choice he makes to deny it." I added my own inscription below it. "This farm is dedicated to those who loved in silence. May it now be a place where love is loud, visible, celebrated, and free." I went back to the farm regularly after that, several times a year. I watched as artists came to stay there, as people used the studios, as the place came alive again after so many years of being frozen in time. I saw young people there, queer people, people who were still figuring out who they were, and it felt right. It felt like Harold would have wanted that, like David would have wanted that. The house stopped being a tomb and became a sanctuary, and I, Harold's widow, became its keeper. I never found out where Harold went on those trips, never confirmed that he actually visited this place, never knew for certain that he had been reunited with David at the end, even if just once, but I hoped so. I hoped that somewhere in the final years of his life, before the heart attack that took him so suddenly, Harold had found a way to reconcile those two halves of himself. I hoped that he had come home. People sometimes ask me if I feel betrayed, if I resent Harold for keeping this secret. And I tell them the truth, which is complicated. I was hurt, yes. I was angry. I felt foolish for not seeing, not knowing, not asking the questions he'd told me not to ask. But I also understand something I didn't understand before I opened that door. Harold was protecting more than just his secret. He was protecting a love that the world had decided should be hidden. He was protecting himself and David in the only way he knew how. It wasn't the right choice, and it cost him, and it cost David, and it cost me too. But it was his choice to make. And now that he's gone, I can honor what he loved, even if he couldn't honor it himself while he lived. If you listen to me now, and you're hiding something about yourself, some truth that you think is too dangerous or too shameful or too wrong to share with the world, I want you to know this. It doesn't have to be that way forever. The world is changing, slowly, imperfectly, but it is changing. And even if it weren't, even if the world was never going to be kind to your truth, it would still deserve to exist. You deserve to exist. You deserve to be known and loved for who you actually are, not for who you have to pretend to be. And the people who love you deserve to have the chance to love all of you, not just the parts you've decided are acceptable. Don't do what Harold did. Don't lock your life away and hope someone finds it after you're gone. Live it. Live it fully. Live it truthfully. Because a life unlived, a love unexpressed, a self unshared, that's a tragedy that happens too often in this world. And I don't want you to be someone's tragedy. I want you to be someone's joy.